Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah. Varevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu b'fimcha beit Yisrael. ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאיהם בית ישראל כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה ברוך אתה אדוני מלמד תורה לעמו ישראל.
Amen.
Amen.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בך בנו מכל עמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, let's just do the Mishnah Brura by Rabbi Daniel Brody. And we on the section where it's being a visitor at somebody else's table. So where's this from? Mishnah Brura, chapter 170, section 16, and the Shulchan Aruch also 170, but section 5. You'll notice that the Mishnah Brura and Shulchan Aruch follow each other exactly. Generally, when it's 170 in the Mishnah Brura, the Shulchan Aruch is also 170. And this is a commentary on the Bach, which is also at 170, but paragraph 6. Okay, so in general, a visitor should listen to all the instructions of the host, whether if he asks the visitor to do noble things, which gives the visitor status, such as giving the speech, or on the other hand, he asks whether the visitor could get involved in the duties of the house. So in other words, if he asks whether it's something you generally, it holds you in esteem in terms of kavod, where everybody listens to you giving a speech or devar Torah, that's considered obviously noble because it's people only generally get given that status if they're eloquent and functional, or if you get given this duty of the maid to have take off the table. Well, both duties obviously help the host tremendously. But there are times where you don't have to obey the host. So, for example, if it's something degrading or unbecoming, such as going out to the marketplace for some errand. In other words, it's considered derech eretz generally to help the guest take off the table, especially not, I wouldn't say necessarily in South Africa where you have help, but certainly in a place where everybody just pitches in and make sure that it doesn't look like there's a bomb that's hidden in the kitchen when the guests leave. So that's not unbecoming of anybody other than getting stuck in and helping. But if it's something degrading, you certainly have no obligation to do it. And certainly, if the host is pushing the visitor to eat or drink more than he wants, the visitor can refuse, since it's not healthy nor pleasant to eat more than one's full. On this note, there is somebody sometimes that I go to pre-COVID that used to give me a bowl full of food because they were generous. Their nature is generous, but it became uncomfortable because there was a whole lot of food left on my plate. And I kept telling them that, I've got a tiny appetite. Just give me a little bit of food. I can always take more. And they didn't listen. And eventually there was a lot of food. They said, you waste a lot of food. And it took every ounce of my strength not to turn around and say, how many times have I asked you not to fill my plate like a horse? I just said, listen, I'm asking you, please give me a tiny portion. So sometimes guests can be put in odd predicaments. So it's just something that you've got to let the host know in advance. And also it goes without saying that if you're recovering from Alcohol Anonymous and on Purim they're edging you to drink, you don't have to listen, obviously. Even halachically, where it says you get drunk where you don't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman, that's obviously assuming that you don't have a drinking problem or you're not going to land up in the ICU. This is obvious. And if a visitor doesn't eat such things because it's a real concern of halacha, he need not obey. But if he doesn't do or eat such things just out of stringency and going beyond the letter of the law, as opposed to where there's a genuine halachic issue, he should obey the host's instructions. Okay, and then not getting angry at the table. In general, one should not get angry, but one should especially be careful not to get angry when they're at the table. This affects the other people that are there. They become fearful to invite poor people, and guests eat less because they're on the edge due to the host's anger. So in other words, here it seems to be talking about the host's anger, but I think in general, Um, anger's like anger's a little bit like at a table is a little bit like somebody in a swimming pool. If you urinate, everybody gets out. So that's it. That's my take on it. All right, maybe these videos shouldn't always go on YouTube. You don't even have to cut this out. That's honestly how I feel. All right, guys, we're gonna start. We're gonna start where we were. We were actually hitting a new part of the duff yesterday. See where we were. Um, just get my book here a second. All right. So where we were. Just give me one fraction of a sec. 22b2. Right. All right. So we on 22b2. So the Gemara challenges Reish Lakish from a different source. Come learn a proof from the following Mishnah, and that Mishnah is in 59b. Okay, if one sets ablaze through a deaf mute, a mentally deranged person, or a minor, he's not liable to pay under the laws of man, but he is liable to pay under the laws of heaven. So we said in brief that Hashem knows exactly what you're doing, and if you give a flame to somebody that doesn't have dayas, so what's dayas known as? Somebody that cannot see consequence of action, somebody that doesn't have wisdom. If you're giving it to somebody that has either mental retardation, is a minor, or is mentally deranged, meaning they don't have all their oars in the water, you're going to have drama under heaven because you have no business giving them your flame. Whether or not man can prosecute you, that's a different issue entirely. Okay, so why is it bringing this challenge to Reish Lakish? Very simple. This ruling of the Mishnah is understandable according to the one who says that one is liable for his fire on account of being deemed his errors. Why? Because in this case, the fire is the errors of the deaf mute. Okay, so what it's saying is here is that we learned Reish Lakish. It was very, very simple. That if you're holding the like Rav Yochanan, whoever sets the blaze alight is responsible because it's their energy, it's their force that is actually causing the fire to be lit. So therefore, if you give it to a deaf mute or a mentally deranged person or a minor, who, according to Rav Yochanan, is responsible for causing the fire? Well, it's the person that set the fire because it's known as his force, his arrows. So according to Rav Yochanan, we found where we said, according to the laws of man, the person that gave him the fire is not liable because who set the blaze? It was the mentally incompetent person that set the blaze. So therefore, legally, it's deemed his arrows, in other words, the person that set the blaze, and therefore the one who handed him the fire is not responsible under the laws of man. So you'd be able to explain that. But we've got a problem as far as Reish Lakish is concerned. What's the problem as far as Reish Lakish is concerned? Because fire is deemed his property. So it doesn't matter. Hi, Stephen. How are you? Hi, Steve.
Hey, Damon, you're right.
All right, and you.
Good man.
So what we're saying is as follows. So, Stephen, just to catch up for a fraction of a sec, we're saying if somebody gives a mentally incompetent person or somebody that cannot see consequence of action a fire, then what happens is under the laws of heaven and Shemaim, Hashem will hold that person responsible. But legally, they're not responsible according to Rav Yochanan because the person that set the actual fire is responsible because it's deemed his arrows, his force. But according to Reish Lakish, that person is responsible because whose property does that fire belong to? Because Reish Lakish sees fire as a person's property. It's the person that actually owns the fire and started it, not the person that set the blaze. So how does Reish Lakish answer that that person is not liable? Does that make sense? In other words, because it's actually it's not the deaf mute in that case would be liable. So how does that work? Okay,
Right.
So, but how? So it says now. I'm just repeating this for Stephen. Now, this
Yeah.
ruling of the Mishnah is understandable according to the one who says that one is liable for fire on account of it being deemed his arrows. For in this case, the fire is the arrows of the deaf mute. But how is this ruling to be understood according to the one who says that one is liable for his fire on account of it being deemed his property? If he had given over his bull to the care of a deaf mute, a mentally deranged person, or a mano, would he also not be liable? So the Gemara answers, while this is not a difficulty, because it was stated regarding this Mishnah, Reish Lakish reported in the name of Rav Chizkiah. The Mishnah taught its ruling that the one who hands the fire to a deaf mute is not liable under the laws of man, only when he handed him a coal, and the deaf mute fanned it into the flame. But if he handed him a ready flame, the first person is liable to pay even under the law of man. Um, so, what's the reason for the person's liability in this case? Well, the damage is ready to happen. If you give somebody a ready flame, then obviously you're looking for trouble. What we learned before is it was different in a case of a pit or a fettered ox, as we touched on yesterday, because a fettered ox or tied up ox is trying to break free all the time. So, therefore, it takes a competent person to ensure that there's measures in place to stop the natural deterioration of the knot of the rope, because the animal will break free. And the same thing with the reverberations and vibrations of the manhole cover on top of the sewerage pit. Because of the cars and the horses driving past, it will loosen it. It's only a matter of time. Therefore, if you get somebody that has no ingenuity or idea that it's a ticking time bomb, then obviously in that case you're responsible. But in this case, you're not responsible, for the very reason is that a coal, unless fanned into a flame, is bound to go out. But if you hand somebody a ready flame, in that particular case, then what's going to happen is it's a disaster waiting to happen. Okay, now there is um, there is a slight difference as far as that's concerned. Rav Yochanan basically holds that the grasp, in other words, the control of the deaf mute, is what causes the damage. And then he accordingly says that the first person is not liable to court imposed damages unless he hands the deaf mute dry wood, small slivers of wood, and a flame. So, what are we saying here? Remember that Rav Yochanan basically says that basically the person that causes the fire is liable because it's deemed his arrows, his force, and therefore even the mentally incompetent person is therefore liable. Whether or not the court will find him guilty because he doesn't have the mental capacity is a separate issue. But again, he doesn't hold that the property of the fire so far at this stage is what causes the damage, and therefore who causes the flame. So then in this case it would be the deaf mute. So he said in order for in other words, at the moment we don't have a fire, we have a deaf mute with a ready fire. So if the deaf mute causes the fire, he's actually used his arrows or his force to actually cause the fire. So then the person that handed in the fire is not liable. And the Gemara basically says only if the first person hands him dry wood, small slivers of wood, and a flame is he liable, because then you're really asking for trouble. You're taking away any sort of ingenuity on the part of the person that sets the fire, even if they're mentally incompetent, because you've actually given them all the things together. All they have to do is hold it together, and the guy's going to go up in flames, or the guy's property is going to go up in flames. All right, next part. So then the Gemara basically records what Rava said regarding this dispute. So Rava said a verse in the Brisa is supporting Rav Yochanan in this matter. So it says, there's a verse that's written, if a fire shall go forth. So basically the expression shall go forth implies that fire goes by itself. In other words, that, how do we put this term? It's in Shemot chapter 22, verse 5. where it reads, if a fire shall go forth and find thorns and a grain stack shall be consumed, or a standing crop or field, the one who kindles the blaze shall surely pay. So what is this basically saying? So this is saying that the person that actually sets the fire should be responsible, not who actually owns the fire. So this is actually a biblical support for Rav Yochanan. Okay, so that's what Rav has said. Now, um, but the verse concludes somewhat differently. It says, "The one who kindles the blaze shall pay." So, so then it would assume what? If I kindle the blaze and then handle you an open flame, that would imply that it's the person that initially set the blaze, meaning that it's not the deaf mute that I gave it to that set fire to a fellow stack. It's rather the person that started the fire and handed it to him. So what it's referring to here is, let's take a case where he started a fire in his own yard and then it spread by itself to his neighbor's property. And there it consumed a stack of grain. The Torah concludes by referring to the person as the one who kindles the blaze, which describes him as if he actually set fire to the stack itself. So this shift of expression actually indicates that the Torah considers the natural spread of fire to be the ongoing force of the one who initially kindled it. In other words, a fire is deemed to be his arrows. Okay, so that's a support from Rav Yochanan. Now, just
Damon?
one thing before we have a question, I just want to finish one sentence and then I'll take questions with pleasure. So learn from this that the one who is liable for fire on account of it being deemed his arrows. Okay? And what is the brisa that supports Rav Yochanan? For it was taught in a brisa, scripture opens with the damages inflicted by his property and concludes with the damages inflicted by the person himself, to teach you that one is liable for his fire on account of it being deemed his arrows. Kevin, what did you want to ask?
Just going back a few steps in terms of liability, if that flame was handed to the deaf mute or mentally incapable, mentally challenged person, and the person handed the flame didn't know that, I mean, I'm with in good faith, then how do you determine liability?
It's a good question, and I'll give you a proof for that. Is that you don't necessarily. I think the office disappeared too on the camera, but I suppose within a relatively short period of time, before you give somebody a loaded gun, I think you would have a brief conversation to determine they have all their oars in the water. Just a thought.
I think you give them a quick IQ test.
But I think you can tell fairly quickly. Although Arthur will tell you, just on a side note for 1 second, remember Arthur when we were at the shops and there was that special needs person that I didn't realize was special needs. What happened to the queue?
You basically, this guy put his milk on top of Damon's stuff by accident. Well, he put it on his stuff. And Damon wanted to knock him out. I said, Damon, the kid's got a bit of a problem there. He says, how do I know? I said, well, I come from a thing where my kids in special needs. So you recognize their face like just by looking. You can see it. It's like, they just have a certain look about them. So I said, calm down.
Exactly. So I'm at the school and I'm paying for stuff in Israel. This guy looks like any other Israeli guy to me, and he puts his stuff, his milk in front of mine, and I think, like, does he want a free milk carton? And I'm busy paying. Can't he wait a second? I look at him, and Arthur sees this flash of madness in my eyes, like I want to thump him. And Arthur says to me, listen, this oak special needs, just give him a bit of a rest. I've been dealing with months of Israelis, just to put it in context there, of people jumping queues. But anyway, Arthur, in his wisdom, worked out that this guy, like, he had problems. So, Kevin, most normal people would be able to ascertain this in 2 seconds. Idiot here didn't recognize that. So, I don't know. So, let's get back to the Gemara. Thank you, Arthur, by the way, once again, for saving me from doing something really stupid.
I mean, it's just an hourly thing with you. It's fun.
Or that one case in your building. Do you remember that one case in your building when when I left
Yes.
Kevin's place, and I'm packing downstairs in the foyer. Just one thing to divert. I'm packing this bag in the foyer, and I'm going to take 10 minutes. I'm away from everybody, and I'm packing my bag to get them back to the other end of Jerusalem. And Arthur's got this neighbor that comes out and starts blasting me because I'm in the middle of the what do you call it? Near the garage, packing my bag, minding my own business. And I turned around. What did I do? I think I told him to go back to his apartment before he gets himself hurt or something.
Yeah, you didn't realize he had special needs as well. But anyway,
Okay.
he has to think about special needs people. He doesn't understand.
I didn't realize he was special needs. I hear this Israeli suddenly start to scream at me, "What am I doing here?" And I'm thinking, this oak is not normal because I'm not even near his place. And I had a hell of a day. I said to him, just go back and lock yourself in your apartment before I thump you. And I was 1 second away from giving him a crack. And Arthur, in his kindness, said to me, Dave, listen, him and his wife were special needs. Just relax. Don't worry about it. So Arthur stopped me from a lot of stupidity. Because you know what? I think it's a language barrier. I think when you hear somebody speaking in English, you can see when they're special needs. But when you don't speak the same language, you're not sure. I just
me, it's just the look. Like I can be on a bus and see somebody, and you know immediately the way they handle it. It's just the way they move. You can see it.
Arthur, you've got that sensitivity because your son has special needs. You have the ability.
And so are most of my friends, actually.
All right, let's go on. All right, so
yeah, we just all in denial.
No, we're not in Egypt. We're in Israel.
So it's eager for 5 years then.
You didn't catch that, guys.
Okay, so the Brisa says in effect that explicitly the very same interpretation is just presented independently by Rava. So Rava is basically saying is saying not only that the concept is that one's fire is deemed as arrows, but it's also explicitly derived from the verse of the Brisa. So all Rava is doing is proving that the one who sets the blaze actually is responsible for the damage. So the Gemara discusses this issue further. Rava says Abaye had the following difficulty. Now, according to the one who said that one is liable for his fire on account of it being deemed as arrows, how do you find that the merciful one in the Torah exempts the person from liability from something hidden in the case of fire? Okay, so let me just tell you what the case is. Do you remember on the third daf, it says that if you had a Picasso in a stack of hay and there was a blaze that set everything alight, you exempt for things that are hidden. Because why? Anybody could turn around and say there was a Picasso stuck in my haystack. So in that case, you were exempt. But now you've got a problem. What's this problem that Abaye is saying? Is that we are always held accountable if we cause direct damage. In other words, it's not a fire. So basically, if you create damage personally, you're liable regardless of the circumstances, whether you cause the damage deliberately or accidentally, or even through an unavoidable mishap. Okay, let's just take the city of refuge. Remember the axe we said that a person lifts up and the axe handle stays in his hand and the top of the axe tongs somebody and kills them, then you're responsible for that. Of course, it was an accident, even an act of negligence, because it's separated from the axe handle, that you are responsible, because that's something you caused directly with your own personal force. So say you get in a fight with somebody and you don't mean to kill them and you push them and they land and they crack their head open on the side of a marble table and then you kill them. In that particular case, you're up for manslaughter. It wasn't purposeful, it wasn't premeditated, but you did kill somebody. So what it's saying here is, how would you answer this issue of Rav Yochanan? Because according to Rav Yochanan, that it's deemed his force, you're not exempt for hidden things. because it was, you only exempt if your fire causes the damage being deemed your property. Does that make sense, guys? So that's in essence the problem. So basically, a buyer himself resolved this question and said, you find it in a case where a fire broke out in one yard and the fence around this yard subsequently fell down, not as a result of the fire. And the fire went and burnt and caused damage in another yard. For in that case, the person's arrows would have ceased. So what are we actually saying here? Is that, say I'm creating a brand, my particular side, and you, Gavin would have had a fence on as my next door neighbor on the property, but it's actually my fence, and that fence would have been a barrier to the fire spreading. It's at that point that it's deemed my arrows no longer have an effect. Why? Because that would have been a barrier to prevent the fire from spreading. Now, it said if the fire was spreading and the wall actually fell down, not because the wall was burnt in a fire, but through accidental means, then in that particular case, the person's arrow have ceased, meaning it's not the person's fault. Meaning, if the wall was up anyway, what would have happened is that the arrows would have stopped at that point, meaning the force of the fire would have stopped at the point where there was a barrier. But since it fell down the wall accidentally, not through negligence, and it burnt the neighbor's property, in that particular case, it's not considered your fault. This is what's proposed. Why? Because in that case, the person's arrows have ceased, meaning the person's flame or fire, etc. So Rabbi Cohen describes it basically as the fact that I'm taking a stone, and I'm busy throwing it from point A to point B, but there's a fence in the way. So when I keep picking up a stone and throwing it against, let me give you a better example. I'm practicing archery, and I've got a fence up, okay? And then I've got a target, and I'm busy shooting an arrow for archery practice. And I've been doing this for years, and all of a sudden, while the arrow has left my bow, the wall fell down, or the fence fell down just accidentally, and that arrow goes through and shatters a neighbor's windscreen. In that particular case, it's considered an accidental damage because the wall fell down. However, if the wall was in a weakened state and you failed to put it up because of negligence, you are responsible. But this leaves a problem. So it's basically saying when the person set the fire, his arrows would have ceased at the property line where the fence stood. And though the fence later fell, allowing the fire to spread to his neighbor's stack of grain, the spreading fire is no longer considered the person's arrow, and he can be exempted from paying for things that were hidden in the stack. But then we're going to have a problem, okay? So the problem is as follows. Is the Gemara asks, if so, that this is the case of hidden things, then regarding exposed things too, his arrow should have ceased. So the Gemara is picking up a problem here. It's saying you can't use that as an argument, because if you're using the argument that it's deemed a person's arrows, and I'm in the property directly where I've set alight the haystack, then I'm responsible for burning those hidden things. Because do you remember Rav Yochanan says he doesn't hold that there's liability for burning hidden things. This is the same person that said that your fire is your arrows. Because if you light something directly, you're responsible. So it says, okay, so if you're setting a fire in the neighbor's yard, in your yard, and it burns the neighbor because your fence fell down, we understand in that case, because it's not on your property, and your arrow should have ceased at the fence, but the fence fell down through some inexplicable accident, while you're not responsible for the hidden haystack, according to the rabbis. But then why would you be responsible for all the exposed things in the fire? So then clearly there's a flaw in the argument. Does that make sense, guys? If you're not responsible for the hidden things because your force had ceased at that point, then why should you be responsible for the exposed things? So then the Gemara answers, rather than the one who holds that one is liable for his fire on account of it being deemed his arrows, also holds that one is liable for his fire on account of it being deemed his property. And for the exemption for hidden things will be found in a case where after the fence fell, because of causes unrelated to the fire, he was able to rebuild it, but did not rebuild it. For in that case, it's like his ox in front, which he did not close the stable door. So I'm just going to explain in 2 sentences before you ask questions. So basically, we're seeing a little bit of a turn of events here, is that we're seeing, in addition to Rav Yochanan deeming a fire somebody's arrows or somebody's force, he's agreeing with Reish Lakish that in a case where you don't, that it can also be deemed a person's property. So this is the first time we're hearing that, according to this view of the Gemara, is that Rav Yochanan is deeming two things, that a fire is a person's property and a person's arrows, whereas Reish Lakish is saying it's purely a person's property. How did we find this out? Because what happens is, if it's just deemed a person's arrows, then anything that they set alight, they should be responsible for, even hidden things. And yet, so that's why Rav Yochanan says you're responsible for hidden things. But the difficulty is then, why are you not responsible for exposed things? Meaning that if I created a fire in my yard and the fence should have blocked it, and in that particular case, it went to the neighbor, the fire, because the fence fell down through an accident not related to the fire. In other words, if the fire consumed the fence, then that is deemed to be an extension of my arrows. But if it ceased at that point because the wall fell down, then we understand why you're responsible for hidden things, because it's directly your force. But the flaw that the Gemara sees in the argument is, then why aren't you exposed for hidden things? And the reason is that Rav Yochanan also deems you responsible for fire, not only in addition to it being caused by your force, your arrows, but in addition to being your property. And the example it uses is that basically, if you see that the stable door is not locked and your horse bolts, you're responsible for that. Why? Because that horse is your property. And it's using that to show that Rav Yochanan is actually agreeing with Reish Lakish that your fire is your property, but in addition to your property, it's your arrows. Any questions before we go on? We've got 1 or 2 things to go through. Guys, any questions? Okay.
So we do in English, basically.
So the Gemara asks, what is the practical implication now? Because if you've explained that the one who holds that one is liable for fire on account of it being deemed his arrows, also holds that he is liable on account of it being deemed his property, which is Rav Yochanan, what is the practical difference between 2 of these views? Okay, and the damages inflicted by his property and the damages inflicted by the person himself is to teach you that one is liable for his fire on account of his error. So let me just tell you what this action means. Just give me 1 second. All right. So look, the practical difference, bottom line, is that do we make him liable to 4 additional things for injuring a person's with fire? So let me just tell you what I'm saying here quickly. We've got 3 minutes. If my property causes you damage, so let's take a look at this. Stephen, my ox has basically damaged you. In that particular case, I only owe you for nezek shalom. It's for the actual damage. But if I punch somebody else, then I'm responsible for damaging man for 4 additional things. What am I responsible for? Do you remember, guys? We're responsible for apart from the actual bodily damage, for
Embarrassment, pain.
correct, scar,
humiliation.
pain, refuah, healing, which is medical
Loss of
expenses,
income.
shevet, which is
Yeah.
unemployment for convalescing and loss of income during the recovery period, and boshet, where humiliation goes. That's exactly right. So we're saying bottom line is as follows, is that according to Reish Lakish, you're only ever responsible for the actual damage. But according to Rav Yochanan, who says that you're responsible as if the fire is one's property, but also deemed your arrows, your force, you are responsible for all these other payments, which is medical bills, convalescing to heal,
Time, yeah.
pain, etc., etc.
Time was
Humiliation, not though, because humiliation is only in the case, even though a person is humiliated if they get disfigured from the fire, humiliation is only, the definition is if you hit somebody in public and they suffer embarrassment. If they suffer embarrassment as a result of the injuries, that wasn't your intent. Unless you're a pyromaniac arsonist, you're not intending to disfigure somebody. You just weren't very considerate. But it's not like you set the person alight. It's not like A hit B in public, embarrassing them. And therefore, for unintentional damage, you pay for all of these things directly in terms of the 4 other damages, but not for humiliation. That's generally a case of like rape, where and it's a case of hitting somebody in public where they're embarrassed because their social stature makes them feel humiliated. I mean, it's terribly embarrassing, but not for a fire. But all the other 4 payments are different. So we see the difference is Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish both say actual damage, but Rav Yochanan obligates in the 4 other payments of medical bills, pain, convalescing, etc. Obviously, but not humiliation. Guys, is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
All right, guys, it's lovely to see you. And Arthur, thank you once again for saving me from stupid situations in Israel.
It's
I
just what
really
friends do. What
appreciate
can
it.
I say?
Thank you.
Okay,
I
Thanks,
really
Damon.
appreciate
Thank you.
it. Pleasure, guys. Ciao.
Yeah.